I'd like to offer some context. Much of what I'm going to be presenting today is the Western science that we've been doing in this project over the years, the fire ecology. However, the context of this is traditional ecological knowledge. And I'm Native American. The science that I do is very formal Western science, but it is through the eyes of someone who is Native, who incorporates traditional ecological knowledge in all I do as a scientist. I learned some profound lessons while I was the chief scientist at Earthwatch Institute for 5 years, based out of Harvard. And what I learned there, I worked all over the world. My job was to oversee a research program with 50 projects on 6 continents. Many of them involved indigenous communities. And I learned that the issues that we have in southwestern Alberta and the crown of the continent are the same issues everywhere where there has been settlement. And I will be talking about that colonization. And where the traditional ways of managing landscapes, including especially fire, have been disrupted. So I saw these patterns in Mongolia, in places like Kenya, in the Amazon, all over the world. Secondly, because of the virus, I have been unable to get into Alberta, into our study site since 2019. I have been working in the US very closely with the Department of the Interior, with Department of Interior funding for a long-term grassland restoration program on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation and surrounding BLM lands. And that work has led to the DOI wanting to create a curriculum for training their staff on traditional ecological knowledge. And I will be co-leading the creation of that curriculum. And TEK is a very hot topic. You had marvelous speakers on this earlier. It's a highly relevant one as we address issues such as an increase in wildfires. And so Oregon State University has offered me a job on their senior leadership team to advise the university on the use of TEK in natural resources science. So that will give you some context. So it started here in this project, which in Waterton, and it has inspired a whole lot of other work and other collaborations. And it really is all about traditional ecological knowledge. So this work began as my PhD studies. I did research in Glacier National Park, but in Waterton, very specifically on fire. And in Waterton Lakes National Park, managers have, over the years, created this beautiful prescribed fire program. And these are some of the prescribed fires that they've set. And you can see that the scale, the scope of them is really substantial, really robust. Not only that, these fires have been set with, they've been calibrated to moderate fire severity, calibrated in terms of how they're positioned. So it's been for me a deep pleasure to work with Waterton managers on these fires. And what I've been doing, along with my former PhD advisor, who is now retired from the project, Dave Hips, is we've been measuring post-fire effects. And the objective was to reduce the aspen cover. So throughout the West, I've worked in Colorado on aspen. You know, the aspen are in trouble, people say. Scientists say, conservationists say, but here in the crown of the continent, aspen tend to be taking over the universe, and the grass, what used to be grassland. And there's a lot of research, like the Mountain Legacy Program and Also repeat photography that's been done by others and historical photographs in the National Archives in Canada. They show that the extent of aspen cover has been greatly increasing over the last 125 years. And so Fescue Prairie is very precious. Globally, at least 75% of the grasslands have been eliminated by agriculture and other forms of human development. And so Waterton contains one of the most intact patches of Fescue Prairie in Canada, certainly. And it's a World Heritage Site. It's an important site. So the questions that managers had is prescribed fire, how is it affecting the extent of aspen cover? How are these fires changing aspen demography? How are they affecting the grass community? And for example, are they causing eruptions of non-native invasive grass species like smooth brome? What are the most useful indicators to track fire effects? And what would an effective long-term monitoring protocol look like? So this is an important slide because it'll provide context for what's going to follow. So our study site is, it's in the Foothills Parkland ecoregion. It's elk winter range. The elk density here, based on studies that I've done, wildlife studies on elk, the elk density is one of the highest recorded in North America. It's comparable to like Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. It's about, I measured it at about 24 elk per square kilometer. Anyway, the Escarine complex is this picture you could see, it's looking south into our study site. This is the Escarine complex in here. It is a rolling grassland dotted with aspen stands. So it's a grassland matrix. The White Camp ecologically is different in that there's this aspen parkland rather than discrete aspen stands. This aspen parkland actually used to be discrete aspen stands, and we did a dendrochronology study where we cored about 800 aspen, and we saw that these aspens, there used to be aspen stands there and they fused together, and that matches some of the historical photographs and observations of people such as the Russell family, who has lived on the border of the park for 100 years. Crooked Creek is right over here, and it's a control site. This is a road that goes to the border crossing at Chief Mountain, is a fairly new road, as in, put in the last 50 years or so. And so this used to all be contiguous, basically. The difference is that Crooked Creek has not burned, and these two sites have been burned in prescribed fires. And this is the blood timber limit. It belongs to the Kainai First Nation. And our study site is BB Flat. It's a grassland. It is Foothills Parkland ecoregion is basically all of this. And this is now the montane zone in here. So this is the grassland in the blood timber limit. And it has not burned, the grassland portion of the timber limit has not burned since the 1800s. So our sample size is quite large. There's a lot of ecological variability, such as differences in moisture, et cetera, within a site like this or that. And so we used a very large sample size and stratified our sampling. So further background, what is popularly termed as a de-wilding, this is a term created by conservation biologist Michael Soule. This system that we're studying has changed quite a lot since 1870. So bison were eliminated through overhunting. And this was fairly systematic. They were functionally extinct by 1880. Fire was eliminated at about the same time because it was seen as a threat to human settlement. And wolves were eliminated for a similar reason. They were seen as a threat to agriculture and to human settlement. At the same time, elk. So per archaeological studies, and some of this is Cliff White's work, there used to be the ungulate population by biomass was probably about 90% bison and 10% elk. So when bison were eliminated and wolves were eliminated, and the wolf is the only animal that can effectively prey on, kill an adult elk. Elk exploded in number. That was seen as a good thing because the elk were used to feed people in mining camps and, just to produce a large source of meat. And by 1930, I did a lot of archival research, and I found in park documents in Glacier National Park and Waterton Lakes National Park reports about the elk problem. And basically the elk had exploded in number and were overgrazing, overbrowsing, and really degrading plant communities. At the same time, cattle were brought in the late 1800s. And so now you have a system that has been modified. The ecological modifications have been huge. These are the grasslands in North America. Our study site is right there. This is the the bison population as it shrank. This is a very famous map by William Hornaday of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And you can see our study site is right in here. And so these darker circles is as the elk population shrank and shrank. And this map was created in 1889. At that time, bison were functionally extinct throughout North America. So I serve on the board of the Society for Ecological Restoration, and I co-authored the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration. My role was to specifically focus on traditional ecological knowledge. And the second principle is that in order to be effective, ecological restoration should draw on all types of knowledge, including local knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. Robin Kimmer, in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and she's written many journal articles, is one of the people who has most clearly defined TEK. And you've heard other speakers define this during this meeting, but her definition, and the one that we use in the standards, is that it's based on the oral tradition. It has to do with deep knowledge and practices that are passed on from generation to generation. And it's informed by, strong, a deep connection to the land, strong cultural memories, sensitivity to change. TEK is about how ecosystems change constantly. So it's not a static world. And it's spiritual. And it includes values that include reciprocity. So it's very different from colonialism. You don't, like, if you come upon a patch of sweetgrass, you don't harvest it all. You don't harvest 90% of it and leave 10% so that maybe some can grow. Maybe you harvest 10% of it, say a prayer, give thanks, and leave the rest for future generations. So it's a very different approach. You take slightly less than what you need from an ecosystem, and you don't look to profit from it. So that's a very different approach than the Western approach to natural resources. So this image on the left is from the area around the shortgrass prairie around Waterton Lakes National Park, and those are Blackfeet. burning the grassland. This is from the Alberta Provincial Archives. Pollard recorded this image in 1910. And what we're finding today, and what in Waterton, these prescribed fires. So Native people throughout the prairies and in grasslands around the world, everywhere I've worked in grasslands, this, semi-arid grasslands especially, have used light, low severity prescribed fires to stimulate sprouting of grasses, which then brings in animals that are used for food, like bison. And these practices were practiced in places like Kenya and in outer Mongolia. And, these relationships, these grasslands co-evolved with people setting fire to them and being grazed on by animals like bison. And what people are finding in places like the Fescue Prairie in Kansas, where there's been, the Nature Conservancy has a site where they have had research going there for, I think, 40 years, is that when you combine bison and prescribed burning in areas where bison and prescribed burning were historically present, this increases biodiversity and ecological resiliency to things such as drought, and it creates a habitat mosaic. And actually, if one goes to the National Bison Range in the Flathead Indian Reservation, one can totally see what this mosaic looks like. It's beautiful there. And that herd has been in that location for many years. That was whatever bison were left at one point were rounded up in the early 1900s and put in that site. And so these relationships are profound because they're evolutionary. So in Waterton, this is the fire history. This red stuff here, these are the prescribed fires that Waterton managers have been setting very recently. This was that big sofa fire. Some of these fires are very old. They go back to the 1800s. This site where we're working, these two sites, had not burned since around maybe 1908, I believe. So we have all these beautiful, tidy prescribed fires, and tidy is the best word for them. They were planned meticulously, carried out flawlessly, and then the Kenow wildfire hit our study site. And I was actually in the field during that fire, and we were evacuated from it twice. So I'm grateful to have had directly experienced that fire. And others have talked about that fire in this workshop, so I'm not going to go into more detail about the scale of it. I am going to talk about its severity in our study site. So I get back into the field after being evacuated the previous September, and in May of 2018, I was super excited to see what it looked like, and I was warned about it. And one manager actually said to me, Cristina, just prepare yourself and be prepared to cry a little when you first see it. It looked like the moon. I've worked with a lot of fire and I've never seen anything like this. This is the prairie. These are actually the root crowns of grasses. This is bare mineral soil. And this is a plot in which we were measuring. This is one of our permanently positioned prairie plots, and we were measuring the changes. However, this is that same site in July. 3 months later. It was astonishing. So I wanted to understand personally how we could go from this to that, this riot of life, and how, the difference between the Kenow wildfire and these prescribed fires. So our methods included plots in aspen and prairie sites, and I'll be showing the results of those. Transects in aspen stands. We collected fire severity data in all of them. We had GPS collars on elk and put in wildlife transects to measure wildlife use, and also examined herbivory with a diet analysis. We used a UAS, a drone, to take ultra high resolution images of our study site. So the resolution was less than 2 centimeters. And we incorporated citizen science, and over the years, we had about 130 members of the Kainai First Nation receive fellowships to join us in the field. And many of them I ended up hiring as technicians, and some of them have developed into leaders in natural resources, like Diandra Brucehead and Monroe Fox. And anyway, this has been a collaboration with the Kainai First Nation, because this project takes place on their ancestral lands. Here's our stratification in the Escarine complex. There's a summer bison paddock and a winter bison paddock. They were sampled separately. There is a small display herd that was there and has just been returned after the Kenow wildfire, the Whitecamp Prairie plots, and the Crooked Creek, and then the Blood Timber Limit. And that's the grass plot sampling. So basically what we found is that the Kenow wildfire burned the Foothills Parkland ecoregion with extreme severity, and I'll discuss that very specifically. It did not cause non-native grasses to erupt. The proportion of native grasses in all sites stayed the same. It significantly altered aspen stand structure. And in the winter diet analysis of elk, basically we did a microhistological analysis of elk and bison diet, and elk browsing on aspen was negligible post the Kenow wildfire, but had been dropping before that. We worked with the CBI and found that it was insufficient to address our ecology questions because it was so homogeneous, this fire. And so, looking at it, it could be said that it was all high severity, but walking around it, we could see subtle differences. And so we created an index, and this was published in a peer-reviewed journal article in Frontiers in Ecology. I worked with Glacier National Park fire manager, Mike McClellan, with staff from the Forest Service, with Steve Wirt, for example, who was formerly the fire manager for the Forest Service, and with Parks Canada managers. And we created an index that was peer reviewed, and to break it out into extreme fire severity, to distinguish that from high fire severity. Also in the Whitecamp, what I need to point out is that when the Kenow wildfire hit the Whitecamp, it kind of petered out. So it was this wall of flame initially that just, moved rapidly across Waterton Lakes National Park. When it hit the Whitecamp, it became more like a classic spot fire that was sending out firebrands. What happened is the edge of the Whitecamp parkland burned with extreme severity, and the interior of the Whitecamp parkland burned with low severity. And I should note that aspen are some of the most fire-resistant trees because they contain a lot of moisture. So you can see how homogeneous it was. 98% of the escarine burned with extreme severity. And in the Whitecamp, the burn severity was significantly lower. and the Crooked Creek burned with extreme severity. And this gave us some nice things to look at. It was fascinating to be able to compare. So with all of these prescribed fires, basically the proportion of bare mineral soil was like 1%. And what we found after the Kenow wildfire is that proportion of bare mineral soil just, skyrocketed. With grass cover, we found the opposite, that, the proportion of grass cover, plummeted, but shrubs stayed the same. And so this is the S green. These are the 2 bison paddocks. We measured them separately and analyzed them separately because bison had been in there for since about 1950. And we figured that may have had significant effects on the soil and other factors in there. The proportion of bare mineral soil, when we looked at prairie sites in 2019, and we only were able to measure the prairie sites in the White Camp, you could see that here's the proportion of mineral soil after the Kenow wildfire, and here it is immediately after the Kenow wildfire, and here it is in 2019. So there's this rapid recovery. And that picture I showed you with all the wildflowers in bloom starts to, hint at that recovery. What happened is that 2 species, Chenopodium album and Calamagrostis montanensis, erupted. And they're native species, and they're actually historical photographs that show the same thing happened after the last fire here in the early 1900s. That's the Escarine complex. And so they're soil stabilizers. They're natural soil stabilizers, and then they cease to dominate a system. They're ruderal species, so they, immediately after disturbance, they go crazy, and then their population declines sharply as the other slow growing species start to take over, like the prairie grasses. We found that the proportion of native grass in prairie sites was unchanged from before the Kenow wildfire to after the Kenow wildfire. And we found a similar thing in aspen. So one exception was in the Escarine complex, and we are going to take a closer look to see why that site is different than the others. It may have to do with fire severity, but we don't know. And then the proportion of shrub cover stayed about the same. The difference occurred in the White Camp, and that may be because the fire severity there was very, very much lower. The shrub volume stayed the same. So one of the concerns managers had was that after the Kenow wildfire, shrubs would take over the grassland, and that is not what we're seeing at all. In the interest of time, I'm not showing results that show the dominant shrub species are the same before the Kenow wildfire, and also in 2008, before there had been any prescribed fire. So fire did not change the shrub community in any significant way. So the UAS work, we found, so we flew the UAS like this in overlapping transects. This is Chris Anderson's master study. We found that the canopy decreased by 98%. Regeneration, that's the sprouting aspen on the edge of an aspen stand, increased. Shrub avulsion are the shrubs that one typically sees on the edge of an aspen stand, also increased, but the only significant change was the canopy, the proportion of canopy in a stand, the mature aspen, and it decreased by a lot. So looking at the basal area of the snags, we found that 2008, you could see the proportion of live aspen versus to the proportion of snags or the basal area. And you can see the big shift here after the Keno wildfire. So this is about the same, you know, and this is in response to prescribed burning, but this is a big shift. And it's the same as what the UAS data showed. For the Y camp, we see, you know, same pattern. And then you get the Keno wildfire shifts things, but these changes are not as pronounced. And then in the interior, there's a strange dynamic happening there, and we need to take a much closer look at that. The sprout density we found was one of the highest aspen sprout densities, almost 500,000 sprouts per hectare, ever reported in North America. And you know, of course, this was significantly different from the sprout density in previous years. So this was due to the Keno wildfire, and this is one of the plots that had, you know, what it looked like in that understory. So the burning question by managers is, you know, are these fires helping keep the aspen down? And the answer is yes, in the aspen stands. There's not a statistically significant change in the transect length. This transect started where the aspen sprouts began at the edge of the stand and ran through the stand until the sprouts ended. So there was not a significant increase in these, even with all that crazy sprouting, there wasn't a significant increase in the size of the aspen stands because we had such a large sample size. So we measured 30 aspen stands and put in 79 transects. This caused us to, you know, this gave us a robust data set to work with. In the aspen parkland, that parkland did expand, but there was such high variance that I can't say that that was significant. One of the issues that we found, though, is that there's no to extremely low ungulate browsing on aspen. By low, I think we only found about 5 aspen stems that had been browsed. Formerly, this area, when I started working in these aspen stands in 2008, had herbivory on the aspen by elk of about 17%. So now we're down to much less than 1%. And this is, I believe that this is driven by plant secondary metabolites, and we need to do an analysis of that on those aspens. Those are substances that aspen produce when they've been burned to render the sprouts unpalatable to ungulates to protect the stand as it's regenerating. We collected a very robust sample of soils from these plots and stratified them by fire severity, and we are also going to be looking at the biochemistry of that soil. Next step is to create an ecocultural restoration plan with the Kainai First Nation for the blood timber limit. We were on track to begin that work last year, but then the pandemic hit, and we are looking forward to resuming that work as soon as we are able to, I'm able to get back across the border and it's safe to do so. I want to thank Parks Canada, so many wonderful people there that have supported this work in so many ways. The Kainai First Nation, my colleagues there who have taught me so much. My field technicians and my former graduate students, Chris Anderson, and many of those field technicians are members of the Kainai First Nation. This has been an amazing learning journey for all of us. And I can't think of a better landscape to be working to figure out how that intersection between TEK and Western science might work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christina. Fantastic and really interesting information on both the grassland systems and how they might differ from forest systems in terms of fire response, and also your very careful use of traditional knowledges. We really appreciate that. I want to give folks a chance to either type in some questions in the chat box or perhaps raise your hand if you'd like to speak and ask Cristina any questions. First, we have Mike Munoz, who says, great work. And then here's one for you, Cristina, from Don Gayton. How big were your grass plots, and did you measure cover by species?
The grass plots were 2 meters in radius. We came up with that research design working very closely with Rob Sissons, who is a botanist and one of the lead ecologists in Waterton. We did not measure proportion of cover by species. That is because we had such a large sample size, and we decided that that could be something we could revisit later on. It would have, because of phenology, we would have been unable to gather all the data in one field season. Had we done that, we would have had to have a much smaller sample size. So we stuck to native grasses versus non-native grasses. We did record every species present in every plot, though. We just didn't measure the area that it covered.
Great, thank you, Cristina. Any more questions for Cristina out there? I'm not seeing any. Here we go. There's one in the chat box. And the question is from Kelly Cooley. Kelly says that Rob Sissons has noted that he is seeing increases in Bromus tectorum, cheatgrass, since the fire. Is this species something you will be doing any special monitoring for?
Yes, I work very closely with Rob, and for this summer we have discussed using some of my the plots that we established and having his staff monitor them, because the effects of fire on a grassland are typically take 7 to 10 years to develop. You know, a fire like this, like the Kenow. And so, you know, given that these plots were last measured in 2018, the ones in the Escarine complex, it's really important to get some data now. And so I'm working with him to determine what his priorities are. So all along, this work has been based on adaptive management, where my research design has been created collaboratively with park managers. And park managers actually were co-authors on our journal article about the Kenow wildfire. And then each year we meet and I adjust my plan for the season based on what managers' priorities are. And it's been just a lovely partnership, you know, really, because they have so much wisdom about that system.
Great, thank you, Cristina. I see that Ann Carlson has her hand raised. Ann, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Thank you, and I'll just come on camera to say hi, so I'm not just talking from a printed word of my name. Thank you so much, Cristina. That was amazing, and I'm not really sure how to formulate this question, so hopefully you can hear the gist. But I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or about potential research that you and your partners might be moving toward or could do. It could really flesh out more of the intersections between fire and bison as they're repatriated throughout the ecosystem more extensively.
Yeah, we have talked about, so, you know, the Kainai First Nation has reintroduced bison. There's a new herd there. And we have had many conversations about using prescribed fire with those bison. And they have some nice baseline data. on the land where the bison have been placed. So we had a meeting actually a year ago to discuss this, and it was through the mountain. Kim Pearson organized the meeting, and it was a full day workshop where we discussed, what our next steps might be. And we're ready to pick that back up right now. The pandemic has just, made a lot of things kind of come to a stop or hit the pause button a bit. But yeah, definitely. And the work that I do in Fort Belknap is very bison related, because there's 2 bison herds there, and the tribe there is working with fire. And this is in collaboration with the state of Montana, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the BLM, and various NGOs. So that is a major next step, really, is to look at the relationship between bison and fire.